On the 18th of August, 1993, a four-engined cargo jet came around the final turn toward a runway at the edge of Cuba, banking harder and harder as its captain chased a flashing light that wasn't there. Behind him, his flight engineer had already said it aloud, "We're not going to make this," and been ignored twice. The aircraft rolled past 40 degrees, past 50, the wings clawing at air that could no longer hold them. A stall warning shook the controls. And still the captain banked, because somewhere in a mind worn down by 23 hours without sleep, the only thought left was the runway he could not reach. What happened in the next few seconds should have killed all three men aboard. That it didn't is the reason we know, in extraordinary detail, exactly how a good pilot can fly a perfectly working aeroplane into the ground, and why this particular crash changed the rules of flying for everyone who came after. This is American International Airways Flight 808. On the 18th of August, 1993, a McDonnell Douglas DC-8 freighter, on approach to the United States Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay, suddenly rolled onto its side and fell out of the sky, erupting into a fireball that rose over the secretive installation. Fire crews racing to the wreckage found the aircraft almost entirely consumed by flames, all except the cockpit, which had snapped off and tumbled clear, and inside which, impossibly, all three crew members were still alive. Their survival would prove to be one of the most valuable things about the entire disaster, because this was not a story of a sudden mechanical failure or an act of God that overwhelmed a helpless crew. This was a crash caused, from beginning to end, by human error, and for once, the humans who made the errors lived to explain them. In reconciling what the pilots remembered with what the black boxes had recorded, the National Transportation Safety Board would produce something rare and profound. Not a reconstruction of a crew's final moments guessed at from the outside, but an account of a catastrophe narrated, in part, by the very people who caused it. And what they revealed was a chain of events that began not with a mistake in the cockpit, but with a crew so exhausted that they were no longer capable of recognizing a mistake when they made one. To understand how three experienced professionals ended up in that field at Guantanamo Bay, you first have to understand the airline they worked for and the strange economy of pressure that produced them. American International Airways was a brand name used between 1985 and 2000 by the company known today as Kalitta Air. It had been founded in 1967 by an American drag racing driver named Conrad Kalitta, universally known as Connie, a nickname that would end up stamped on the side of the accident aircraft and spoken aloud as its radio call sign. The airline specialized in cargo, both scheduled and chartered, along with some charter passenger work, and by the 1990s it had become a significant contractor for the United States Department of Defense, running freight out of its base in Ypsilanti, Michigan. During Operation Desert Storm, it had flown hundreds of military supply runs. It was, in short, exactly the kind of workhorse operation that keeps the machinery of a superpower moving. And much of that work, in the early 1990s, was carried on the backs of an aging fleet of four-engined Douglas DC-8s. It was one of these D-8s that operated a string of cargo flights between the 16th and 18th of August, 1993, under the command of Captain James Chapo. And here it is worth pausing to be absolutely clear about something, because it matters enormously to everything that follows. James Chapo was not a bad pilot. He was, by any ordinary measure, an excellent one, a highly experienced aviator with more than 20,000 flight hours to his name, more time in the air than some entire flight crews could boast between them. Alongside him on this 4-day trip sequence were First Officer Thomas Curran and Flight Engineer David Richmond, both of them also seasoned professionals with thousands of hours of their own. These were not careless or reckless men. They were good at their jobs. Remember that, because the whole point of this story is that being good at your job is not enough when you have been awake for too long. The trip that would end at Guantanamo did not begin as anything unusual, just the ordinary grind of a cargo pilot's life, which is to say a schedule built almost entirely around the night. The cruise sequence started with an overnight flight from Ypsilanti to St. Louis, Missouri, and then onward to Dallas, Texas, where they finally arrived at noon on the 17th of August. They slept as best they could through the afternoon and evening, which, for people whose bodies wanted to be awake in daylight, was not very well, and then reported for duty again at 11 o'clock that night. From Dallas, they flew on to Atlanta, Georgia, touching down just before 8 o'clock on the morning of the 18th. At this point, the plan was for the crew to rest. Both Captain Chapo and First Officer Curran lived in Atlanta, and both intended to go home, sleep, and see their families. Flight engineer Richmond planned to check into a hotel and do the same. They had done their overnight flying. They were, by any humane reckoning, owed a bed, but before any of them could get home, the phone rang. Another AIA aircraft, scheduled to collect a load of submarine parts in Norfolk, Virginia, was unable to make the flight, and the company needed a crew to take it. The cargo belonged to the Department of Defense, and its destination was the naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Flying to Norfolk, loading the parts, carrying them down to Guantanamo, and returning to Atlanta would take, at the very least, 11 hours. 11 hours tacked onto the end of a night shift for 3 men who had been counting the minutes until they could sleep. Every one of them was reluctant, and what happened next, the fact that they went anyway, is where the deeper machinery of this disaster begins to turn. The first question the crew asked was not whether they wanted the assignment, but whether it was even legal, and the answer they arrived at is a small masterpiece of how safety can be quietly eroded by the fine print. Under the flight and duty time regulations that governed them, a crew flying a domestic route could be assigned a maximum of 8 hours of flying within a 24-hour duty period. But Guantanamo Bay, for all that it sits on a sliver of American-controlled soil, counts as an international destination, and international flights were permitted up to 12 hours of flying time in that same period. That extra allowance was just enough to make the outbound journey to Cuba technically legal. It was not, however, enough to cover flying the empty aircraft all the way back to Atlanta afterward. And so AIA reached for a second loophole, and it is a telling one. The company operated the empty return leg, the ferry flight in the industry's language. Under Part 91 of the Federal Aviation Regulations, the section governing private, non-commercial flying. Part 91 imposes no duty time limits whatsoever. By reclassifying the empty homeward leg as a private flight rather than a commercial one, the airline could legally send its pilots past the 12-hour ceiling that was supposed to protect them, and everyone aboard, from exactly the kind of exhaustion that was about to bring them down. The pilots felt, correctly, that this was pushing things. But here the pressure that shaped the whole story reveals itself, because the crew's reluctance ran headlong into something stronger than fatigue, the knowledge of what refusing would cost them. Technically, they could turn the assignment down. In practice, they all understood that if they did, their superiors would demand a very good reason. And at American International Airways, "I'm tired" was not, in the culture of the place, considered a good reason. So they weighed a bad night's sleep against a difficult conversation with the boss, and, reluctantly, they climbed back aboard the DC-8 and pointed it toward Norfolk. As First Officer Curran would later put it, with the weary understatement of a man describing an ordinary indignity, he had not been particularly enthusiastic about going out for another 7 or 8 hours of flying, and would much rather have gone home and got a good night's sleep. But he went. After collecting the submarine parts at Norfolk, the DC-8 lifted off and set course for Cuba as American International Airways Flight 808. And to understand the peculiar trap that was waiting for them at the far end of that flight, we need to talk about Guantanamo Bay itself, because the accident that was about to unfold was rooted, quite literally, in the geography of the Cold War. The United States naval base at Guantanamo Bay is older than Fidel Castro's Cuba. It predates the revolution of 1959 that brought a communist government to power on the island, and when that revolution came, the United States simply kept the base, while pointedly declining to maintain any diplomatic relationship with the new government 90 miles off its coast. The result was, and remains, one of the strangest political arrangements on Earth, a patch of sovereign American-controlled territory, home to a functioning naval air station, entirely surrounded on its landward sides by the territory of a nation the United States did not formally recognize, and that arrangement imposed a hard and unusual rule on every aircraft that flew there. American aeroplanes landing at Guantanamo were forbidden from entering Cuban airspace that began in places mere hundreds of meters from the runway. Fly the approach imperfectly, drift a little wide, and you were no longer making a sloppy landing. You were committing an international incident. This made the base's airfield, Leeward Point Field, one of the more demanding places in the world to bring an aeroplane down, and the authorities knew it. Every crew scheduled to fly there was required, beforehand, to watch an informational video laying out the hazards of the approaches to its 2 runways. The crew of Flight 808 had indeed seen this video, but during training, and for 2 of the 3 men, this would be their first time actually flying to Guantanamo in the flesh. Captain Chapo had never landed there. Flight Engineer Richmond had never landed there. First Officer Curran had flown into Guantanamo years earlier, during his time in the Navy, but never in command of anything remotely as large as a DC-8. In practical terms, then, this was a crew arriving at one of the trickiest airfields in the Western Hemisphere, with almost no first-hand familiarity with it. And, as we will see, without even the written manual that most airlines carried for exactly this situation. By 20 minutes to 5 in the afternoon, Flight 808 had begun its descent toward Guantanamo Bay. By this point, the 3 men in the cockpit had been on duty for 18 hours, and they were, all of them, deeply tired, though crucially, tiredness does not announce itself the same way in everyone, and the way it was manifesting in this cockpit was itself part of the danger. Fatigue is not simply the feeling of wanting to sleep. It is a measurable degradation of the brain's ability to function, and among the very first capacities it erodes are precisely the ones a pilot most needs: the ability to assess risk, to make sound decisions, and to juggle several demanding tasks at once, and it does not feel from the inside like impairment. Captain Chapo, worn down by the long night, was sliding into a state of lethargy and indifference, a growing detachment, a sense of things happening at a slight remove. First Officer Curran, by contrast, was experiencing fatigue in almost the opposite register. He felt strangely exhilarated, even a little giddy, in the way that profound tiredness can sometimes counterfeit a kind of drunken lightness. Neither man recognized what was happening to him. Neither would have described himself in that moment as unfit to fly. This is the quiet horror at the center of the story of Flight 808. The very faculty you would need in order to notice that fatigue is impairing your judgment is itself one of the first things that fatigue impairs. The crew could not see the problem, because the problem was located in the seeing. And now, into this fog of exhaustion, came a decision so strange that the investigators who later heard it on the cockpit voice recorder could scarcely believe their ears. The default runway at Leeward Point Field that day was runway 28, and its approach was relatively straightforward, a fairly ordinary arrival from the east, out over the bay. But the airfield's other runway, runway 10, the very same strip of concrete approached from the opposite direction, was a different beast entirely, and it was almost never used by large aircraft, for good reason. The threshold of runway 10 sat only about 1.2 kilometers from the Cuban border. To land on it, an American aircraft had to approach from the south, out over the sea, carefully hugging the international boundary, and then execute a sharp 90-degree right turn to line up with the runway at the very last moment. The timing of that final turn had to be, in a word, impeccable. Turn too early or too late, fly it too wide or too tight, and you would either overshoot the runway or stray across the border into Cuban airspace. Controllers almost never assigned runway 10 to airliners. Pilots almost never asked for it. At 4:41 in the afternoon, Captain Chapo asked for it. His exact words, preserved on the recorder, carry a casualness that is difficult to square with the stakes. He suggested making it a runway 10 approach, as he put it, just for the heck of it, to see how it was, reasoning aloud that if they missed, they could simply come back around and land on runway 28 instead. It was, on its face, an astonishing thing for a professional cargo captain to propose, to attempt one of the most difficult and politically fraught approaches in the hemisphere, in a large 4-engine jet, at the end of an 18-hour duty day, essentially out of curiosity. And here the second failure of that cockpit made itself felt, not a failure of one man but of 3. Neither First Officer Curran nor Flight Engineer Richmond raised any objection. No one pointed out the difficulty of the approach. No one said the obvious thing, which was that this was not the moment for an experiment. The idea was floated, and it simply hung there, unchallenged, and became the plan. The controller herself was plainly baffled. She cleared Flight 808 for the approach to runway 10, but she asked the crew, in so many words, whether they were quite sure they didn't want runway 28 instead. First Officer Curran confirmed that they wanted runway 10. And so it was settled. The crew committed, by their own choice, to threading a heavy jet through the eye of a needle at the edge of hostile airspace. And in their haste to set up for this unfamiliar arrival, they skipped past something that would matter enormously in a few minutes' time. They never discussed what they would do, or how they would fly it, if they found themselves unable to line up with the runway and had to abandon the approach. They did not brief the go-around. They simply descended toward the border, looking for a light. At 4:52, as Flight 808 maneuvered toward its unusual approach, the controller passed the crew the standard warning given to every aircraft attempting runway 10. Using the aircraft's call sign, she told them that Cuban airspace began 3/4 of a mile west of the runway, and that they were required to remain within the airspace marked by a strobe light. This was the crucial piece of the puzzle. The strobe light was the crew's one visual anchor, the beacon that told them where American soil ended and Cuba began. Stay on the correct side of the strobe, and you were safe. Cross it, and you were over enemy territory. There was only one problem, and it was catastrophic. The strobe light was not working. A strobe had indeed been installed for exactly this purpose, mounted on a guard tower at the point where the border meets the sea, to help pilots locate the invisible line they must not cross. But it was, on this particular afternoon, switched off or broken, and the controller on duty, a trainee, did not know it. So she told the crew of Flight 808 to look for a light that was not there, and the crew, trusting her, set about looking for it. They were now searching the shoreline for a beacon that could never appear, and the longer they failed to find it, the more anxious they became, because layered on top of everything else was a specific and growing fear. The crew had heard rumors, unfounded but vivid, that Cuban border guards would open fire on aircraft that strayed across the boundary. As Curran later described it, they had been intimidated by the thought that there might be armed guards along the fence perimeter. Chapo put it more bluntly still. Everybody, he recalled, had told them the Cubans would shoot them down. So here was a fatigued crew, on an approach they had never flown, hunting for a navigational aid that did not exist, increasingly frightened of drifting a few hundred meters in the wrong direction, and all of it was about to converge. Flight 808 made its second-to-last turn, rolling out heading north, perpendicular to the runway, and the crew began scanning for the strobe that would tell them where the border was. Captain Chapo asked the question that would come to define the entire approach. Where's the strobe? Both Curran and Richmond spotted a flashing light and thought it might be the one they were looking for. It was not, because the actual strobe was switched off. Investigators later concluded that what the two men had seen was almost certainly sunlight glinting off the tin roof of a small shack, several hundred meters inside American territory, a reflection, not a beacon, and one that sat in the wrong place. But the crew did not know that. "Right over there," said Richmond, pointing. "Where?" asked Chapo. "Right inside there," Curran said. And here, amid the fruitless search for a phantom light, came the first of the warnings that could have saved them, and the first time it was ignored. Flight engineer Richmond, whose job it was to monitor the aircraft's systems and performance, noticed that their airspeed was decaying. "You know, we're not getting our airspeed back there," he said. This was not a minor observation. Their speed had fallen below the minimum required for the approach, which meant, by the book, that the approach was now unstabilized, and an unstabilized approach has exactly one correct response. Abandon it. Go around, climb away, reset, and try again, or divert to the easy runway. That was the moment to do it. But Captain Chapo was not listening to his flight engineer. He was listening only to the question in his own head. "Where's the strobe?" he asked again. "Right down there," said Curran. "I still don't see it." The tension in that cockpit now began to break through even the fatigue. "We're never going to make this," Richmond muttered, the second time, in effect, that he had told his colleagues the approach was coming apart, and for the second time the others carried on as though he had not spoken. "Right over here," Curran said again, his own frustration mounting as he tried to point his fixated captain toward a light that wasn't there. And again, like a needle stuck in a groove. "Where's the strobe?" Chapo asked. This is fixation, target fixation, the tunnel vision of a depleted mind, and it had now seized the two men at the controls almost completely. Chapo could not stop searching for the strobe. Curran could not stop trying to help him find it. And between them, they had tuned out the one crew member who was calling the actual emergency. Richmond kept saying the true and urgent thing: "Our speed is too low. We are not going to make this." And it kept vanishing into the space between three exhausted people, unheard. Because they could not find the border, they had flown the pattern wrong. Unable to fix the position of the strobe, the crew had begun their turn onto the penultimate leg too soon, and the consequence of that error was now closing in on them. They had not left themselves enough room to complete the final turn onto the runway. First Officer Curran began at last to voice the doubt that Richmond had been shouting all along. "Do you think we're going to make this?" he asked. Chapo's answer is one of the most haunting lines in the entire recording because of what it reveals about where his mind was. "Yeah," he said, "if I can catch the strobe light." The aeroplane was running out of sky. His flight engineer had twice declared the approach dead. His first officer was now openly doubting, and the captain's entire conception of the problem had narrowed to a single flashing light that did not exist. Everything else, all the mounting evidence of catastrophe, had been squeezed out of his awareness by fatigue and fixation until only the strobe remained. Then Chapo began the final turn, and he began it from a position that made success flatly impossible. He was about 610 meters south of the runway and 914 meters to the west of it, geometry from which lining up a DC-8 with the runway simply could not be done. But he tried anyway. He rolled the big jet into a 30-degree bank to the right, 30 degrees being the steepest bank normally used in routine airline operations. It wasn't enough to bring the nose around in time, so he banked more steeply. And as he did, the trap that had been waiting in the physics of flight the entire time began, silently, to close. Here we have to pause on the aerodynamics, because the mechanism that destroyed Flight 808 is invisible unless you understand it, and it is one of the most important and least intuitive facts in all of flying. An aircraft's wings hold it up by producing lift, and in level flight that lift points straight up, directly opposing gravity. But when an aeroplane banks into a turn, the lift tilts with the wings. Bank 30 degrees, and the lift is now angled 30 degrees away from vertical, which means only part of it is still doing the job of holding the aircraft up. The rest is pulling it sideways into the turn. The steeper the bank, the less of the wing's lift remains available to fight gravity, and to compensate, the wings must work harder, which means the aircraft must fly faster to stay aloft. In technical terms, the stall speed, the speed below which the wings can no longer generate enough lift to keep the aeroplane flying, rises as the bank angle increases. A wing that will happily fly at 120 knots straight and level might stall at 140 knots in a steep turn. The margin you thought you had simply evaporates as you roll into the bank. Now put the two halves of Flight 808's situation together. Captain Chapo, fixated on the runway, was steepening his bank 30 degrees, then 40, then 45, then 50, which was driving the aircraft's stall speed upward, and at the very same time, distracted from his instruments, he was allowing his airspeed to fall, down to 136 knots and dropping. His stall speed was climbing. His actual speed was sinking. The two numbers were racing toward each other from opposite directions, and there was only ever going to be one moment when they met. Flight Engineer Richmond, still doing his job, still trying, called out yet again, "Watch your airspeed, keep it up." As before, no one acknowledged him. Chapo, holding a bank of around 50 degrees, would have needed a speed of at least 147 knots, simply to keep the wings flying, and he was more than 10 knots below that, and slowing. The aeroplane was now, in the most literal sense, running out of the ability to stay in the air. As the bank angle reached toward 50 degrees, the stall warning fired, the control columns beginning to shake violently in the pilot's hands, the aircraft's last automated plea to tell them that catastrophe was seconds away. "Stall warning," someone called out. But Chapo kept banking, rolling now toward 60 degrees, still chasing the impossible alignment with the runway. "I got it," he said. "Stall warning," Curran and Richmond said again, almost in the same breath. "I got it, back off," Chapo shouted. Someone yelled for max power. Someone else screamed that there it goes, as the aircraft, banked now to nearly 90 degrees, its wings all but vertical, finally exceeded the limit of what the air could do for it. The DC-8 stalled, dropped its nose, and fell out of the sky just short of the runway threshold, rolling as it went. It struck the ground on its side, the right wingtip carving a deep furrow through the earth before the entire aeroplane cartwheeled into a vast ball of fire. The cockpit, at the very front, broke off cleanly, snapped away, as one witness memorably put it, like the tip of a pencil, and rolled clear across the ground as the flames consumed what remained of the fuselage behind it. Both pilots would later find that the moment itself had been erased from their memories. Chapo did not remember the instant of impact. Curran's recollection of the crash itself was simply gone. A group of firefighters happened to be conducting a training exercise nearby and saw the whole thing. They raced to the crash at once. Burning debris was scattered across an enormous area, and the spilled fuel had ignited the dry grass, starting a blaze that was rapidly spreading out of control. But as the firefighters reached the wreckage, they realized two things in quick succession. The broken-off cockpit had come to rest away from the main fire, and someone inside it was calling for help. They climbed in through a hole torn in the floor and found all three pilots hanging sideways in the mangled remains of the flight deck, gravely injured but alive. One by one, fighting back the flames that were now licking across acres of grassland, they pulled James Chapo, Thomas Curran, and David Richmond out of the wreckage. The rescue cost them their fire truck, which was burned over where it stood while its crew worked to free the men. But all three pilots came out alive. In a rare flicker of cooperation between two governments that did not speak to each other, American officials obtained special permission for an air ambulance to cross Cuban airspace and rush the injured pilots to a hospital in Florida. The very border that had so terrified the crew now opened, briefly to save them. Meanwhile, the National Transportation Safety Board assembled a team and traveled to Guantanamo Bay to begin the investigation, and carried the black boxes back to Washington. When they sat down and listened to the cockpit voice recording, for the first time, they were frankly astonished to hear a captain with more than 2 decades of experience proposing to fly one of the hemisphere's most dangerous approaches just for the heck of it. It was a level of apparent unprofessionalism so wildly out of keeping with Chapo's long and competent career that it demanded an explanation. Good pilots do not, as a rule, simply decide to do something like that. So the central question of the investigation became not merely what the crew did, but why a demonstrably excellent captain made a string of decisions that, laid out on paper, looked like the work of someone who had never flown at all. The significance of the choice to attempt runway 10 is hard to overstate, and the NTSB's analysis of it is damning in a very specific way. When investigators studied the runway 10 approach in detail, they reached a startling conclusion. The average DC-8 pilot could not have completed that approach at all without either exceeding the aircraft's bank angle limits or straying into Cuban airspace. In other words, the maneuver Chapo casually set out to attempt was not merely difficult. For an aeroplane of that size, flown correctly, it was very nearly impossible, which sharpened every question hanging over the crash. Why would a captain of Chapo's experience take such a risk? Why did neither of his colleagues object? Why, once it was obvious he couldn't line up, did he not simply go around? And why did no one else reach over and take control? Part of the answer lay in what the crew hadn't been given. Most airlines that flew into Guantanamo carried a special manual describing the procedures and hazards at Leeward Point Field, precisely because of its unusual status. American International Airways did not carry one. There was also a safety net that should have caught them and didn't. The Department of Defense contract officer in Norfolk was supposed to brief crews on the special approach procedures before they flew down, but he failed to brief the crew of Flight 808 because he wrongly assumed that Captain Chapo had been to Guantanamo before. And so the only real preparation the crew had for this notoriously tricky airfield was that informational video they had watched during recurrent training more than 5 months earlier. A video that the NTSB concluded did not adequately convey the risks in the first place. A demanding approach, an unfamiliar crew, no manual, no briefing, and a 5-month-old video. The deck had been stacked long before anyone keyed the radio. But the deepest cause, the one the NTS ultimately placed at the very center of the disaster, was fatigue. When investigators reconstructed the pilot's sleep in the days before the crash, the numbers were stark. In the 48 hours before the accident, Captain Chapo had slept only about 8 hours, roughly half what he normally needed. Over the same period, First Officer Curran had managed only about 10, and both men had spent the previous 2 days running night operations, which had thrown their body clocks into disarray, so that they were being asked to perform at their sharpest, at precisely the hour their bodies were begging for sleep. Research by NASA had established that repeatedly failing to get enough rest causes a person to build up what is called a sleep debt, a cumulative deficit, whose effects compound so that each successive night of too little sleep bites harder than the last, and the consequences of that debt fall most heavily on exactly the mental faculties a pilot cannot do without: the ability to take in information, to weigh options and decide, and to manage several things happening at once. Laid against this understanding, the bizarre chain of errors suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. It was clear to the NTSB that a crew this competent could only have behaved this way because fatigue had hollowed out their judgment from within. Fatigue was why Chapo, feeling sluggish and detached from reality, failed to assess the risk of runway 10 and chose it anyway. Fatigue was why, once committed, he fixated so completely on the missing strobe light that marked the border. Fatigue was why Curran, too, became absorbed in that fruitless search, so that both men at the controls tuned out Flight Engineer Richmond, as he said, again and again, that their speed was too low and they weren't going to make it. And fatigue was why, in the final turn, Chapo became so consumed by the effort to line up with the runway that he did not register that he was rolling his aeroplane straight into the ground. Chapo himself, listening back to the recording afterward, could barely comprehend his own behavior. It was very frustrating, he told the investigators, to lie awake at night and try to understand how he could have been so lethargic while so much was going wrong around him. The interviews with the surviving crew gave the investigation something almost no other crash could: a direct window into what fatigue feels like from the inside and how completely it can hide itself. Chapo described himself as a day person who had always struggled with night shifts and could never sleep well in daylight. During the layover in Dallas the day before, he had managed perhaps 4 hours of poor quality rest. His memories of the accident flight were foggy and incomplete. He vaguely remembered Curran expressing doubts about the approach, but he had no memory at all of anyone warning that the airspeed was too low or that they weren't going to make it, which was, in its own way, the most chilling confirmation the investigators could have received. It meant that his depleted brain hadn't consciously overruled those warnings. It had simply never registered them. They had been spoken into his ears and vanished. First Officer Curran, for his part, initially said he hadn't felt fatigued at the time at all. It was only after listening to his own performance on the recording that he conceded he had probably been far more tired than he'd realized. Even the people inside the fatigue could not in the moment feel how impaired they were, which is precisely what makes it so dangerous. And here the story widens out from 3 exhausted men in a cockpit to the airline and the system that had put them there, because the NTSB did not stop at the flight deck, and neither should we. When investigators examined American International Airways as an organization, they found an operation riddled with problems. The airline's activities were scattered across multiple locations in the United States, and as far afield as Saudi Arabia and South America. And the lone F&A inspector assigned to oversee it complained that he simply wasn't given the funding to travel to these places and see how they were being run. 2 weeks before the crash, 2 weeks, that inspector had sent his superiors a memo stating plainly that he could not properly oversee all of AA's operations because he lacked the resources to do so. He reported that the airline tended to do no more than the bare minimum needed to satisfy the regulations, and that he frequently had to resort to unorthodox methods just to get it to comply with his recommendations at all. The relationship between the airline's pilots and its management was meanwhile poisonous. In the months before the accident, repeated instances of abuse and verbal intimidation had driven the pilots to begin discussing. Forming a union, the FAA inspector corroborated their complaints, testifying that AIA's management was relentlessly profit-driven and that pilots had reported numerous flight and duty time violations. Out of all this had grown a culture in which pilots were simply expected to take whatever assignments they were handed, with no regard for how tired they were. Captain Chapo said he had never once heard of an A pilot refusing a trip on the grounds of fatigue, and a pilot who had dared to do exactly that told the NS what it had cost him. Afterward, he had been subjected to intimidation by his superiors. As Curran dryly summarized the unwritten rule of the place, if you objected to taking a trip, you could be in for a little conversation with the boss. It would be easy and wrong to read this as a story of uniquely villainous management, and the NTSB's account is fairer and more useful than that. AIA's managers were themselves under real pressure. The airline's contract with the Department of Defense was lucrative but demanding, and the DoD would penalize AIA if too many of its flights left Norfolk late. To protect those contracts, the airline pushed its crews to the edge and routinely reached for legal loopholes like the one that sent Flight 808 to Cuba. On top of that, the company tried to run with as few managers as it could, so that individuals were left doing the work of three, and regulatory compliance slipped through the cracks simply because there was no one with time to attend to it. At one point, the exasperated FAA inspector had to threaten to hold up approval of the airline's new Boeing 747 operations just to force it to bring its flight manuals up to date. None of this excuses what happened, but it explains it. It reveals a crash that grew not from a single bad actor, but from an entire structure of incentives that treated human endurance as an infinitely renewable resource. At the conclusion of its investigation, the NTS did something it had never done before. It listed pilot fatigue not as a contributing factor, the usual hedged secondary place such things were consigned to, but as the probable cause of the accident itself. This was genuinely unprecedented, and it mattered enormously. It was the board's considered judgment that this crew was entirely competent under normal conditions, and that the crash would simply not have happened had they not been so profoundly impaired by exhaustion. In naming fatigue as the cause rather than a footnote, the NTSB was making a statement to the entire industry. That flying people past the limits of human endurance was not an unfortunate background condition to be noted and set aside, but a direct and sufficient cause of aeroplanes falling out of the sky. The recommendations followed from that conviction. The NTS urged the FAA to close the loophole that let airlines exempt ferry flights from duty time limits, the exact trick that had made Flight 808's marathon legal. It called on the FAA to overhaul its duty time regulations to reflect the modern science of fatigue. It recommended that AIA provide proper crew resource management training and specific training on how the aircraft behaved at steep bank angles. It called on the Department of Defense to ensure that every civilian contract crew was briefed on the procedures and hazards of special airports like Guantanamo, and it recommended that the FAA require airlines to teach their pilots about the effects of fatigue itself, to make the invisible enemy at least visible. The three men who walked away from that field did not walk away unmarked. Thomas Curran lost a leg in the crash. A boulder had torn through the floor of the cockpit and destroyed his footwell, crushing his right leg where it rested on the rudder pedals. And yet he was able to keep flying for a time, and in a turn that gives this bleak story an unexpected grace, he later became an investigator for the very organization that had investigated him, the NTSB. Captain Chapo was less fortunate in one respect. Back injuries from the crash forced him to retire from flying altogether. Flight engineer Richmond, the man who had said the true thing over and over into a cockpit that would not hear him, made a full recovery, returned to his career, and in time rose to the rank of captain himself. Today, duty time limits for pilots in the United States are far stricter than they were in 1993, and no crew would ever again be kept on duty as long as the crew of Flight 808 was. In that sense, this crash did exactly what the best accident investigations are supposed to do. It changed the rules so that the same thing could not easily happen again, and untold numbers of pilots and passengers who will never know the name of Flight 808 are safer for it. But fatigue has not been vanquished. It remains a constant companion of anyone who flies through the night, a hazard that no regulation can fully legislate away, and it continues to shadow crashes and near misses around the world to this day. The final defense against it is not a rule but a habit of honesty, a pilot's willingness to look clearly at their own condition and admit when they have reached their limit, which is, in the end, exactly what Captain Chapo asked of everyone who came after him. Thinking about those things a great deal in the years that followed, he said he wanted people to understand that it could happen to them too. "If you're fatigued," he said, "call it in.